Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Come in, Ray.
Hello, welcome to the podcast. Chad is here with me today, and we are both holding our copy of Douglas Groothuis' huge tome of a book, Christian Apologetics, a comprehensive case for biblical faith. But I'm looking forward to speaking with Douglas Groothuis today. What have you been thinking about the chapters we're looking at today, Chad?
I'm super excited to talk to Doug about the problem of divine hiddenness. Has always been one of the, I think, stronger arguments against God's existence. And I also love the fact that in his chapter, in the second edition of the book, he also brings out the fact that God can appear hidden also to Christians, and that they can struggle with doubt and things like that. And I think that's often overlooked, that there's a divine hiddenness, that atheists claim that they want to know God and God seems hidden from them. And then, of course, there's divine hiddenness where Christians can be calling out to the Lord or going through certain struggles and suffering, and God can seem absent. And so I like the fact that he brings out both. And then, of course, the argument from beauty is an argument that I'm anxious to learn more about. I have heard philosophers like John Mark Reynolds actually defend it. I'm looking forward to talking to Doug about that argument and kind of picking his brain as to why it's not used more and how to use it effectively. Mm-hmm. How about you? What did you think?
Yeah, well, to fill in the listeners, we are looking at those two chapters in particular because they're added new chapters. I think there's about 7 new chapters in the second edition of Doug's book, Christian Apologetics, a comprehensive case for biblical faith. I've read those 2 chapters, but I'm also halfway through rereading the book. I was just reminded about how amazing and full of content this book is and how Doug is as a writer and as a thinker. I really appreciate him. Let me tell you guys a bit about Douglas Groothuis, if you haven't heard of him. He's a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and Society of Christian Philosophers. Probably other societies that are just too numerous to list. He is also professor of philosophy at Denver Seminary. So he's got a whole pile of books. I mean, plenty. Things about unmasking the New Age, ones on Pascal, books on truth, books on Jesus, books on the soul in cyberspace. We'll list them all in the show notes. Go buy them all. They're all good. So his newest book that we're talking about today is the second edition of Christian Apologetics, a comprehensive case for Christian faith. So we'll link that in the show notes as well. And just really excited to have Doug Groothuis back with us after like 10 years. So let's get ready for the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Doug Groothuis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, we're real excited to have you on again. And it's been a little while, but we've got your new book, Christian Apologetics, a comprehensive case for biblical faith. It covers the landscape of apologetics in just a completely comprehensive way, very detailed but easy to read, and makes a cumulative case for the Christian faith. Doug, this is a second edition now, so can you just talk a bit about maybe some of the things that you've added in and why you've made a second edition?
Yes, well, the first one came out in 2011. And I teach at Denver Seminary, so I teach apologetics at least twice every year. So I would teach through my book, and I would think, well, I left this out, and I left something else out too. And it wasn't so much that I thought I made a lot of mistakes. It was that I think I need to cover other areas that are very significant. So the first book did well enough being used at seminaries and Christian colleges and universities that InterVarsity indulged me with the idea of doing a second edition. So this one is about 10 and a half, 11 years after the first edition. And all the chapters are updated. In some chapters, I removed some issues that were maybe a little bit dated. I went after some of the emergent church thinkers in 2011. And I think that they are no longer very strong voices in the Christian world. So I removed some of that material and a few other disagreements with other Christians and how they did apologetics. But there's 7 new chapters. So we've got a chapter on original monotheism. I take my handout to count these, get this all down. Original monotheism. And I've got a chapter called In Defense of a Church, 2 new chapters on the atonement, one on the hiddenness of God, one on the argument from beauty, and one called Lament as Christian Apologetics. And then also, Dr. Hess and Dr. Blomberg updated their chapters. Dr. Blomberg has a long chapter on the reliability of the New Testament, and Dr. Blomberg has a shorter appendix on some of the apologetic matters related to the Old Testament. So I'm a philosopher, not a biblical scholar per se, so I was really thankful to have my colleagues from Denver Seminary contribute those chapters.
Well, very good. I mentioned there you take a cumulative case approach as far as your apologetic methodology. We won't spend a lot of time talking about that, but I do want to ask you how you would describe that approach and why you take it.
Well, the cumulative case approach is where you consider a worldview as a hypothesis about reality. So you consider things like, what is the ultimate reality? What is the human condition? What is wrong with the human condition? Where does morality come from? Is there an afterlife? Things like that. And then you ask, what worldview best answers those questions, those deep, perennial, and also existentially charged questions. So there's a lot of evidence to draw from. You can draw from science, history, human experience, scripture, and so on. So the idea is sort of like a courtroom where you bring in witnesses to make a case. And you may have eyewitnesses, you may have character witnesses, expert witnesses, forensic evidence, and so on. And the various lines of evidence converge on a conclusion. So that's the method that I use. I think it makes the most sense. It appeals to the most arguments in a coherent way. And it's also intrinsically comparative. So you ask, what best explains the origin of the universe? Is it Christianity? Is it atheism? Is it pantheism? And my answer is that it's Christianity. In fact, that the universe has an origin needs to be argued for, which I do through mostly the Kalam cosmological argument.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a very comprehensive and coherent and cogent way of doing apologetics. And it's quite adaptable, too, because you have these various lines of evidence. No one argument or two arguments does all the work. Defending Christianity is objectively true, compellingly rational, and pertinent to life. Let's say you're talking to someone who believes in a God, but they're not sure much about that God. Maybe they believe in a creator, but that's about it. Well, then you don't have to give them the cosmological argument because they already believe in a creator. Or maybe you can shore it up.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you want to go directly to Jesus. Who is Jesus in relation to God? Are the New Testament documents reliable? Who did Jesus claim to be? Then you can use the argument that what we find about Jesus is not a legend. He was not a lunatic. He was not a liar, but in fact, he was Lord, that kind of thing. So I find it to be a very helpful, and also I think it can take the best of the other approaches to apologetics. The only other approach it doesn't use would be fideism, and fideism really isn't an apologetic. It's more of an anti-apologetic. That's the idea that faith and reason are completely different, and that having religious faith requires no rational support. In fact, it should not even seek rational support. Now, there's some clever people who try to make that into an apologetic. Like, we have this special protected belief you can't touch, you can't refute. But I find basically nothing helpful in fideism. But presuppositionalism, evidentialism, reformed epistemology, and so on, I find elements of those to be helpful.
Mm-hmm. I like the idea of the cumulative case because there are so many different arguments. I think it's how we naturally reason, whether we're doing it consciously or not. We're taking the whole of our experience. And one of the parts of our experience is beauty. But you don't hear that a lot when it comes to, hey, let's try to persuade someone that God exists. We may not pull that out in the first go. And so we do want to spend some of our interview today talking about the argument from beauty.
Yeah, so just wanted to know if you could kind of share the premises of the argument from beauty that you share in chapter 13 of the second edition of your book, and then briefly summarize what the argument's trying to demonstrate or argue for.
Right. This is a new chapter. It's really a version of the argument from design, but unlike the fine-tuning design argument, which is pretty technical and involves a lot of scientific data, this is more appealing to our intuition of what is beautiful, what is sublime. But it does take a specific argument form. So the way I've stated it is that objective beauty is found in various forms in both creation and culture. So we've got natural beauty like mountains, sunsets, star clusters, things like that. And then we also have great beauty, let's say, in the music of Bach or John Coltrane or the paintings of Van Gogh, things like that. The second premise is God, that is monotheism, explains the existence of beauty by viewing God as the ultimate artist. Therefore, the existence of God gives the best explanation for beauty. Now, of course, you need to test that thesis against something like atheism or pantheism. But let me give you two more propositions. For Christian theism adds a dimension of beauty, principally through its worldview. I think the Christian worldview is quite beautiful in its coherence and in its answering of the deepest human questions. And also the beauty of the incarnation, the way that everything God did through Christ dovetails so beautifully, especially in all he did with the atonement of reconciliation and expiation and propitiation and union and so on. So therefore, Christian theism offers the best explanation for beauty. Now, the first three statements would say that monotheism is a better explanation than atheism or pantheism or polytheism. But then when you add in 4 and 5, you specify Christian theism. Now, the argument in some ways is very powerful. In other ways, for some people, it may not be. And the big stumbling block for a lot of people is the first premise. That is, objective beauty exists. Now, many people think that beauty is only in the eye of the beholder. So beauty is relative. It's not objective in any object or event or anything. So beauty is simply one's feeling that something is beautiful or sublime or something like that. So you need to argue that there is such a thing as objective beauty. Once you argue that, then you try to determine which worldview best explains objective beauty. So the best explanation needs to be internally coherent. It needs to cover what it is supposed to describe, and it should not contradict with other known elements of knowledge. So the argument that there is objective beauty it can be challenging because I think especially in our consumer culture, we consider aesthetic objects in terms of their effects upon us. So one person likes classic rock, someone else likes rap. One person likes Salvador Dali paintings and someone else likes Thomas Kincaid. You know, it's just all a big booming, buzzing confusion of taste. And with some folks, you can't get beyond that. So you could just say, wait a minute, let's take it from culture to nature. Let's consider star fields. Let's consider breathtaking mountains or the Grand Canyon or some animals, not mosquitoes, but some animals, like very brightly colored fish that are just remarkable.
Not stink bugs. No,
yeah, I'm still trying to figure out the role of certain insects in my worldview. I'm 65. May have to wait for the afterlife to figure out why God created mosquitoes, but they do have a purpose, but I'm not going to use them in the argument for beauty, all right? I might use them to illustrate that it's a fallen world, right?
Yeah.
So you could say, let's consider the natural wonders that we experience. And I'll give you an example. When I was in graduate school, I was talking to one of my fellow students, and there was a beautiful sunset. And he looked at it and he said, when I see something like this, I feel so grateful. And I said, who are you grateful to? And there was a long silence. Because if you are grateful for a natural occurrence, such as a beautiful sunrise, sunset, then is there an object of your gratitude? So that led to some worthwhile spiritual discussions with this young man many years ago. I've lost track of him. But he had this feeling of something that was awesome in the older proper term. It's a superlative. It inspires awe, reverence, respect. Now, no human being painted that or arranged that. It's not a fireworks display. it's in nature. No human being had anything to do with it, except we do perceive it. So the atheist has to simply say, as Bertrand Russell did in his debate with Copleston back in 1948, the universe is just there. Or to make it more like Russell, it's just there. The universe is just there.
Right.
So no purpose, no meaning, no design. I think that goes against our best intuitions, really. So if we have this sense that it is beautiful, that it's art, you might say, then you don't have art without an artist, meaning there is an intelligent creator behind these remarkable phenomena. But I think you can also make a case that there is real objective beauty in cultural artifacts as well. Although developing an artistic sensibility that notices objective beauty is more difficult or more refined than learning mathematics or physics or how to ride a bicycle. It takes usually more effort and exposure, but you can point out contrasts. So with painting, for instance, you could say, consider some very prosaic but very maudlin kind of sentimental painting like a Thomas Kinkade painting. And then consider the subtleties and innovation of a Van Gogh painting or the emotional depth of a painting by Georges Rouault or something like that. Or you can do this with music too.
Yeah. Or mathematics.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. One jazz writer said one way to understand jazz is to listen to a high school jazz band and then listen to a professional jazz band. And you can tell professional is better than the high school jazz band. So there is aesthetic value and aesthetic hierarchy. And remember, the atheist has to explain everything merely on the basis of chemistry, biology, and physics. There's no property of the beautiful. All they can do with living things is tie beauty to reproduction. I mean, talk about being a killjoy, you know? I mean, the only purpose of beauty is reproduction. The only meaning to beauty is reproduction. Now, obviously, they're correlated in some cases, but not the beauty of a sunset or a sunrise or the ocean or a Miles Davis muted trumpet solo. So they just don't have the chops. Naturalism doesn't have the chops to explain beauty as beauty. So they really have to deny that it exists. And one of my criteria for evaluating worldviews, I give 8 in one of my chapters, is that it shouldn't leave out anything important. So if your worldview says that everyone's sense of objective beauty is just wrong, and we've got to get back to the biology of Darwinism and a universe that's just there, is, in that sense, a very rationally and existentially inadequate worldview.
You know, one of the things that is fascinating to me is, and I'm sure you probably know this, but even like a skeptical philosopher like Paul Draper, he says this. He says, theism is supported by the fact that the universe contains an abundance of beauty. A beautiful universe, especially one containing beings that can appreciate that beauty, is clearly more likely on theism than on naturalism. Mm-hmm. So you have that, you know, sense that even some atheist philosophers are willing to say, yeah, beauty makes more sense on theism. Why do you think it is then that you don't really hear this argument too much anymore? It seems to me in apologetics nowadays, most apologists, and maybe I'm wrong here, but it seems like they rely a lot on the kalam or the teleological argument, the moral argument. And one of the refreshing things about you including the argument from beauty is that I don't see it used that much. Mm-hmm. So why do you agree that it's not used that much? And if so, why is that?
I think that evangelical apologists don't use it too much. Perhaps Catholic apologists do more. But back to Draper, I think this shows why a cumulative case is so significant, because Draper says that a beautiful world is more likely on theism than atheism, but he's still an atheist. So he thinks there are good arguments against monotheism. And the idea is, well, the argument from beauty moves you a little bit towards monotheism, but not far enough. And his big hang up, of course, is the problem of evil. So if you were debating Paul Draper, you might use the argument from beauty because he already gave it to you. But then you're going to have to work really hard to deal with the objection of the problem of evil. And you probably want to support your argument for God with a really powerful fine-tuning argument, kalam argument, moral argument. I am very interested in the arts. I have been for a long time. I'm a music aficionado, especially jazz, and I love great painting, and I've studied these things. A bit of an amateur drummer myself. And I thought, when I would teach this book, the first edition, I kept saying, there's the argument from beauty too, but I didn't talk about it. And I would make a few comments. And I got sick of hearing myself saying that year after year after year. So I said, come on, write a chapter on it. Because often we feel a sense of wonder and humility in the face of great beauty, a sense of transcendence. You might use Peter Berger's idea of a signal of transcendence when we experience majestic natural or even beauty that comes out of culture, music, painting, dance, whatever it may be.
I remember just as a kid, and maybe everybody as a kid has a story like this, but you're out on a summer night and you're laying on the grass and you look up and it's pitch black except for the stars, which are piercing through the clear sky. And you could see the whole Milky Way. And I remember just laying out with a friend after running around, doing whatever. I remember him saying, how can you look up there and think there's no God? And, anytime you look up there, that is awe-inspiring, or as you said, awesome. And it just seems to me that maybe in the world we live in, or we're just in front of screens all day, this beauty has escaped us. And now it's sort of back to, I know you're like into Pascal, but everybody's sticking a screen in front of their face so they don't see the pit they're going to fall into of death. But I'm wondering, I suppose we could argue that Christians should be making more beautiful things and stuff. And you mentioned maybe some Catholics that would maybe use this argument more. I not long ago read some Peter Kreeft, and in the front of his book, he sort of jokingly yet seriously says, the music of Bach exists, therefore God exists. He says, you might think that's a joke, but I'm serious. I'm just wondering, apart from just telling Christians, create beautiful things, how can the argument be used in evangelism? Is there a proactive way that we could use those things? What are your thoughts? Maybe you thought about it way more deeper than me, so that's what I'm asking.
Well, I think stories are significant. And in the book, I give a story of a Russian atheist physicist who came to believe in a creator by trying to create mathematical models to explain aspects of the universe. In fact, my first wife, Becky, who's with the Lord now, interviewed this fellow, and she wrote it up in a magazine. So this is before any Christian talked to him. He didn't read William Lane Craig. He just did his equations about the universe, and he said these equations related to the world are so beautiful that there has to be an artist behind these. And again, going back to that young fellow who looked up at the sunset and said, I feel grateful. So one can appeal to things like that. And I think your point about screens is very significant because most of us live in the man-made world, the built environment, about all the time. And when you get out and go on a hike in Alaska, or if you go, I'm not a fisherman, but if you go fishing and catch a beautiful salmon and you eat that salmon right away, you don't even freeze it, and you taste it, you just feel gratitude. And I don't think you have to be a Christian to feel that way. I think if we slow down, pay attention, and consider that this big, wide world, which is, yes, full of suffering, still has tremendous beauty and is actually a gift to us. And I think back to Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the earth his handiwork. That's called natural revelation or general revelation in theology.
Yeah. I think that might be a good place to transition, because first we're talking about the beauty that is all around us, and it's like the cosmos declares the glory of God, and stars and creation and design. Yet there is this argument against theism or Christianity that you've also added into the book where you deal with it, the argument from divine hiddenness. So maybe God is hiding, but we see his fingerprints on everything if we're willing to look. So we want to transition to talking about the hiddenness problem as it relates to God. Could you just define what that is, and then maybe we'll unpack it some more with a few different questions?
Right. The divine hiddenness argument is, in a way, an epistemic version of the problem of evil. So the problem of evil says that if God is all good and all powerful, we wouldn't expect either any evil or as much evil as we find. If God were all good, he wouldn't want there to be this much evil or any evil. If God is all powerful, then he could prevent it. So this version says if God is all good and all powerful, and let's add a premise, and he wants people to know him, then why wouldn't he make himself more evident to us? So let me read you how I laid this out, how I laid out the argument. It's basically, if God exists as an all good and all powerful being, there would be no honest atheists, since God would want people to know him. That is, no one could be rationally justified in their unbelief in the existence of God. There would be no non-culpable unbelief. 2, there are honest atheists. That is, there are atheists who are rationally justified in their unbelief. So there is non-culpable unbelief. That is, honest belief or an honest atheist. Conclusion, therefore, God does not exist. Now, the issue for this argument is, are there honest atheists, really? Now, there are a lot of atheists. Some were theists and became atheists. There are some people, one man I debated years ago, who claimed to have always been an atheist, even as a little kid. I don't know if he's telling the truth or not. But the way that I approach this is to consider a number of factors. One factor is, what is the mode of God's communication to human beings? Does God absolutely overwhelm us with his presence all the time? And the answer to that is no. I cite Pascal, who said there's enough evidence for those who want to see and enough obscurity for those who don't want to see. It's almost like God calibrates his revelation to our receptivity. So it is possible to suppress the truth in unrighteousness, as Romans 1 puts it. So I don't really think there are honest atheists. I think there is plenty of evidence for the existence of God, intuitive evidence, just looking up at the stars on a dark night. There's also the sense of the moral law within, as Kant put it, the conscience that bears witness to a higher moral reality. And then you've got very sophisticated ontological arguments, cosmological arguments, design arguments, and so on, that I think make it very convincing that there is an infinite personal God. So what you have to do is talk about the mode of God's revelation, and then also I spent a little bit of time talking about self-deception, which is a topic in psychology, philosophy, and so on. And we do sometimes deceive ourselves about maybe our abilities, our opportunities, whatever it may be. You know, you gain a fair amount of weight and you just stop looking in the mirror. That's my trick, you know. Maybe if I don't look, it's not there. So we can deceive ourselves about small things or bigger things or the ultimate issue. We could deceive ourselves about God. We could just stop attending to how he makes himself known in our conscience and in nature and in other ways, and then replace our God awareness with purely physical, purely perhaps hedonic concerns. So at the end of the chapter, I won't read it, but I have this terrific quote from Greg Bahnsen that was in the Westminster Theological Journal back in 1995, just a few years before he sadly passed away at age 47. But Bahnsen was certainly a presuppositionalist of the Van Tillian stripe, but his comment on self-deception, the way he ends the article, is very profound. So I included it there. And I don't think you need to be a presuppositionalist to appreciate what he had to say about self-deception, because it's very biblical. And I can grant what he says within my own cumulative case method, I believe. So there's been a lot of work on this, and my chapter doesn't go into the depth of some of the other writings about this. This has been a major issue in philosophy of religion for about 30 years. Mm-hmm. But I think it can be dealt with without begging the question or committing the ad hominem fallacy, because the atheists want to say, well, you're just telling me I'm a bad person, because I don't want there to be a God. Well, actually, there's some folks that have come out and said that. Friedrich Nietzsche has a quote to that effect. More recently, Thomas Nagel, you probably know that quote where he said, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. And I give those quotes actually in another chapter. So I think we can handle that problem if we're careful about it. But you will get pushback from some of the atheists. I remember hearing Michael Tooley once say, look, you telling me I'm a liar? There's no God, and I am rationally convinced there is no God. So stop telling me that I somehow have suppressed that truth.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, if I think about somebody like philosopher J.L. Schellenberg, he argues that if a perfectly loving God exists and is open to a relationship with any finite person, there should exist no non-resistant non-believers. Yet, of course, he claims that non-resistant non-believers exist, therefore God doesn't exist. So if I'm understanding you correctly, and believe me, I'm open to your correction if I'm not, you would say then in response to that these people may think they're non-resistant non-believers, but in reality, they're self-deceived. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, I am. I do that, again, only in light of the cumulative case for Christian theism, because however many skeptics or atheists there are, we've still got really powerful arguments for the existence of God. So, and for Christianity, not just monotheism, but Christian monotheism. And so, given the resources of Christianity and given the case for Christianity is strong, given the cumulative approach, I think we can then give a general account of what self-deception is and how it works, and then give a religion-specific, that is Christian-specific, account of what self-deception is. Now, if we had no good arguments for Christianity and we just say, you people are self-deceived, the Bible says you're suppressing the truth, then that would not be a good argument. That would just be ad hominem. That would be begging the question. But I think given a cumulative case approach and given a certain understanding of what self-deception is, and the fact that you have quite a few, or you have noteworthy atheists who have just come out and said, Aldous Huxley did this as well, and Nietzsche and Thomas Nagel. They said, we didn't want God to be there. And so eventually we stopped thinking about God, or we pushed God out of our picture. The Huxley quote, the Aldous Huxley quote, is very telling. And he says, we decided we didn't want God to be there because we wanted to be sexual libertines. And eventually,
I remember that. Yeah,
eventually, lo and behold, we stopped believing in him. And he just comes right out and says it. It's remarkable. Right. Remarkable. Now, Schellenberg or other people can say, well, I'm not like that. Well, maybe not overtly, you're not like that. But we have an account of why there are atheists biblically, I think, that holds up. And also James Spiegel wrote a good book on this about 10 years ago, the Christian philosopher. I am not remembering. The Making of an Atheist by James Spiegel. That is a superb book. And then also R.C. Sproul's older book, The Psychology of Atheism, which was put out in another edition called If There Is a God, Why Are There Atheists? And I appeal to both those gentlemen's works. Very good. And Greg Bahnsen. And I just left that out of the first edition. I guess I thought the arguments are so strong that I don't want to deal with these people. But my conscience got to me and said, come on, it's a big issue and it's not going away and you need to overtly address it. And I draw quite a bit on Pascal for this too.
I found that really helpful.
Yeah. I drew a little bit from a book I wrote some years ago called On Pascal. And I have a chapter in that book called Skepticism and the Hidden God. And I was able to enfold some of that into this chapter with quite a bit of new material.
When it comes to the idea of hiddenness, there's so many things that come into my mind because I just think it's such a misguided idea. It seems like, on one hand, you have people who are very brilliant thinkers, and they might appeal to this hiddenness argument. But I'm just sometimes want to just say, wait, stop. You're trying to argue philosophically for a proposition when we're talking about a relationship with a person who, if we're looking at, as you say, a worldview as a whole, and you've got the Christian God who lays down the conditions of his discovery, which entails humility and seeking, and the fact that he does hide himself and he does require obedience and things like that. And there are certain things you're going to have to do. It's like saying hey, I can't talk to the president. I can't say, why can't I see the president? It's sort of that sort of thing where there's rules here. And if you won't submit to the rules, you don't talk to the president. We're reducing it to a sort of philosophical argument where it's like, wait a minute, if you're trying to find this God that you say you're trying to find, why are you not going about it in a different way? That's why I like Pascal as well, because he's basically saying, put yourself in the place of doing the things that will seek him out. There's a seeking that's involved. So I just wonder if the whole idea is a case of wrong expectations or just a complete misguided endeavor. I don't know. That's my frustrated question.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I feel that way too quite often. Sometimes atheists will say things like, well, if I see some celestial spectacle that spells out my name in the clouds, then I would believe there is a God. You just lay out something absurd. You're telling God how he needs to reveal himself for you to believe in him, and that gets everything backwards. So there are signs, there are indications. We need to seek them. Now, I was looking for this quote, and I found it where atheists sometimes really tip their hand. This is Francis Crick, who was the co-discoverer of the double helix structure of DNA.
Sure.
Great biologist. He says this, quote, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved.
Yeah.
Let's keep up the faith here. It's not designed. It looks like it. It looks like a machine. It looks like a computer. It does the work of a machine and a computer. But we've got to keep in mind, we got to keep before us that this is a product of blind biological change, and there's no designing mind behind any of it. Keep it in mind now. Talk about suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. There it is. This brilliant man, Francis Crick. But people can be brilliant in one area and not brilliant at all in other areas. Like with Stephen Hawking, he was a brilliant physicist, but philosophically, he was terrible. He said things like, the universe created itself out of nothing through gravity. Goodness, where do you start? Nothing can create itself. That's a logical impossibility. And if it created itself, it's not actually out of nothing. And also gravity is something. So you've got about 3 mistakes in one idea. So you might say, well, this man is utterly brilliant. We've got to take seriously what he says about God. And I have to invoke the great economist Thomas Sowell, who says expertise is not transferable. So his expertise in physics is marvelous. In metaphysics, it's abysmal. As a philosopher, he was absolutely terrible.
Wow. One Pascalian point you highlight that might surprise some people is this. Skepticism, this is Pascal, skepticism can be a prelude to Christian faith and therefore should not be quickly banished by apologetics. Yeah. And can you unpack that a bit? Because I could see how some would see that as almost counterintuitive, because a lot of apologists, they want to extinguish that skepticism as quickly as possible. Right. But it seems like Pascal is saying that it can actually be a tool to lead in the right direction. Can you, if I'm understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I'm drawing from Pascal, but also I have significant disagreements with him because he rejected natural theology, where I am a strong proponent of it. But I think his point still stands within my system of apologetics, and that is the fall affected every aspect of us, our intellect, our will, our emotions, everything. And because of the fall and because of our tendency to make ourselves the center instead of God, and our tendencies to divert ourselves from the hard realities of life, that often we just have lost our way. We don't know what to do. The universe puzzles us. And we can say that puzzlement or that skepticism is not a terminal condition, but it indicates the disorder of the human self because of the fall. Now, God does hold us accountable for what we know from nature and conscience. We see that in Romans 1 and 2 especially. But I think we also need to sympathize a bit with the skeptic and not in any way dismiss them and say, well, tell me why you were skeptical. Because skepticism is not the default position. A lot of people think it is. You have to prove everything to me or I won't believe anything. Well, you don't live your life like that. You don't think that way when you're driving in the car or when you're seeing a medical doctor or something like that. But why do you wonder whether or not there is a God? Or why do you think you don't know if there's an afterlife? Lay it out to me. Or if people say, no one could ever know whether or not God exists, I'd say that is a huge knowledge claim. Why is that? What is it about the universe and the human mind that would preclude the knowledge of a God who created us? What is it exactly? So, take what the skeptic says seriously, and then also make them justify their skepticism, and say also, I can explain why you don't feel at home in the world and why you have these doubts about reality. It's because you're a fallen being. Your mind has been corrupted by the fall, but it is not useless. It does not deceive you all the time. And there are good and sufficient reasons to believe there is a God and to believe that Christ is God incarnate. So let's work those through step by step.
Amen.
When I was reading the chapter on divine hiddenness, there was one, I stick things on my iPhone and then I have the text read to me, that sort of a thing. So I wasn't looking at the page, but then I had to pick up the phone and go back a little bit because you said this phrase in there, conditioned cognitive access. And I was wondering if you could unpack that as it relates to this idea of divine hiddenness, because I thought it was a really great point.
Yes, I think I originally got that idea from C. Stephen Evans and developed it to some extent. It's the idea that some things you know very simply and very directly. You don't have to study or develop any skills. But many things are not like that. So the cognitive access is conditioned upon certain behaviors or on certain attitudes. Much of life is like this. So you can go to a piano and bang your fist on it and make noise. But if you want to experience what it's like to play the piano musically, then you have to learn how to play it, how to read music, probably, and so on. So if you want access to that realm of knowledge and beauty, it takes time. And Scripture says that God opposes the proud but exalts the humble. So if your attitude is, even if there is a God, I don't really care. I want to live my life the way I deem fit. And if I have to face God, then I'll just tell him, here I am, deal with it. I've heard people say that to me. It's such a foolish thing to say. But God opposes the proud, but exalts the humble. So I think to know anything, you have to be humble. I don't mean saying, I'm worthless, I can't know anything, but basically to be open to what reality might disclose to you through seeking. I think it was C.S. Lewis said that to read anything requires humility. You have to say, what is the author saying? I need to listen, or I need to read what the author is saying. On the largest scale possible, I need to consider if there's an author behind nature, there's an author behind Scripture. I need to at least be willing to consider it, and if the evidence is sufficient, to submit. Schaeffer used to say that to come to God, we have to bow. We have to bow before God as our creator. We have to bow before Scripture as the revelation of God. And we have to bow before Christ as Lord. So we have to bow 3 times in humility to be properly related to reality. And if you just say, I don't care, I want to go my own way, and sing the Fleetwood Mac song, then it's pretty unlikely you're going to find any truth, really. That's how we look at phenomenologically. Now, God is sovereign and God gets through to people as he will. And I'm actually quite reformed on that. But still, there's so much in Scripture about humble yourself, seek the Lord, be open. Don't close down the doors of knowledge through pride. So I think an apologetic worth its salt needs to consider those kind of things. I mean, even something as straightforward as you're talking about Jesus and the work of Christ for our salvation with an unbeliever, you could say, how much have you been exposed to these ideas? Have you ever read one of the Gospels, all the Gospels? Have you attended an evangelical church service? Have you heard a sermon? And in some cases, people have not. And so that conditioned cognitive access, well, why don't you pursue it? And that's how Pascal's wager finishes. We could do a whole show on the wager, but a very significant part of the wager is where Pascal says, God is worth seeking, given everything you have to gain if Christianity is true, and given everything you have to lose if it is true and you don't believe it. You have so much to gain if it's true and you believe it, so much to lose if it's true and you fail to believe it. That prudentially should encourage a kind of, one writer called it a devotional experiment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one quote that you sort of end that chapter with, where I wrote down, I loved it. It says, "Often it is we who are hiding from God and not God hiding from us." And this idea of humility, I just think that's so key, and I love how you emphasize it throughout that chapter.
So, Doug, I was curious. I have a friend who I've been talking to about God and Christ for probably over 10 years. And he's been looking into the question of God's existence, Christianity. We're actually looking in right now together into the question of who Jesus is. And he claims he wants to know if God exists or not, but he can't step over the line. He can't be sure. And he's given me various reasons as to why. But basically, if I had to give a summary in this conversation, it would be that he just can't know for sure if God exists.
Yeah.
So what would be your encouragement to him?
Well, a couple of things. One would be, you don't need total certainty to have knowledge. So if I'm convinced something is true and I've done my epistemic diligence to look into it, I might be wrong, but I have no reason to think I am wrong. So let's say something like my trust in my dentist. Been to this dentist for about 10 years. He's excellent. He's a fine Christian man. But is it possible next time I go see him that he has a psychotic break with reality and tries to drill my head open? Yeah, that's in some horrible horror story, then that could happen. But I don't worry about it. I have no reason to worry about it, even though it's possible that my faith in Dr. Bailey could be betrayed, because aliens are beaming down something into his brain to make him evil, or some natural brain event happens. So my point is, and J.P. Moreland makes this all the time, you don't need total certainty to have knowledge, because knowledge is what's called justified true belief. So justification has levels. Now, I am absolutely and totally sure that A does not equal non-A, the law of non-contradiction. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. It's a necessary truth. It can't be false. But most of things in life, we deal with on the basis of probabilities. So you don't have to have total certainty, or to put it religiously, you don't have to have perfect faith. Jesus said, if you have faith like a mustard seed, use that. The second point would be the experimental or experiential element here. So, for example, when I became a Christian in 1976, I believed there was a God and that Christ was the way, and I confessed Christ publicly. But my devotion and my depth of knowledge of God grew from there. It's far stronger now than it was 45 years ago, 46 years ago. So if you believe, you can cry out to the Lord like the man did in the Gospels, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And Jesus did not reject that man. He answered his prayer. It's not hypocritical to pursue God and to take steps of faith, even if you still have some level of doubt or perhaps just questioning. I think a lot of Christians would grow in the depth of their faith, the knowledge of God, if they simply looked at their questions intellectually. What is it that holds me back from completely following God? Are there any areas of Christianity that I'm not convinced of? If so, isolate them, address them, and grow in your faith. Don't be lazy about this. So maybe that's helpful, and I will certainly pray for this gentleman.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Doug, we're coming up on our time. We really appreciate, coming on to do the interview. I'm going to have to take you up on that offer to do a whole show on Pascal's wager.
Okay.
We were talking about that at some point.
We literally just were, yeah.
Excellent work with this second edition. Be recommending it to everybody. If there's only one giant apologetics book they can get, this should be it. Where can people find more of your resources and writings, or where you're blogging these days?
Well, I have a webpage called, very uncreatively, douglasgroothuis.com. You can find a lot there. And the book, the second edition of Christian Apologetics, will be on Amazon in about a month, but you can get it right now from InterVarsity Press webpage.
Cool.
It is at Amazon on Kindle, but there were some delays because of supply chain problems. So the hardback just came out this week, but Amazon won't have it for a while. But you can get it from InterVarsity hardback right now.
Great. Well, Doug, thank you so much, and all the best on future endeavors.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address, or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.